In your piece, you address some of the potential downsides for extended masking in kids. One of them being carbon dioxide, maybe excessive inhalation of carbon dioxide, pathogens potentially building up in the mask, the moistness of the mask. Also, importantly, maybe an interference with social development with kids who need to see the facial features and language development as well. If you could address that, it'd be really terrific. We'd appreciate it.
That's right, Dan. You know, some kids do very well with masks, and for a short period of time, there may not be much of an effect, but we're coming on 2 years, and if we're going to use a mask, let's see the data that shows it really works. It may slightly reduce transmission. It may rank as number 5 or 6 in mitigation things that we can do. But let's not ignore the fact that some kids really struggle with the masks. And 40% of cases of anxiety, which, by the way, anxiety and depression are way up in the United States in children, they're related to some irregularities in breathing. It could be rapid breathing from the anxiousness. And when you put a mask on somebody, that is going to have some interaction with the breathing pattern. And although adults can downplay this, for kids, it can be very real. For kids that wear glasses, it can be very real that they have trouble seeing. For kids with disabilities, cognitive and physical, that's about 5% of school children in America. The mask can make it extremely difficult. They can't learn. And I think we've got to remember that, you know, there might be some pluses of masks in areas of active outbreaks, but what we saw is a recommendation to do it for every one of the 56 million Americans, regardless if there's much COVID in the background, regardless if they're vaccinated, and regardless if they have any special needs. And we've got to factor everything together. And we need exit criteria if we're going to put things on. We need to know when we can take them off.
So, Doctor, there was a JAMA study, I believe it was JAMA Pediatrics, and it was discussing the potential, again, downsides of masks. It's discussed hypercapnia. Again, I mean, for some people listening, especially on the left who haven't heard this before, we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. And one of the downsides was excess inhalation of carbon dioxide that, in fact, gets trapped in the masks. Well, the study was retracted. And from what I've read, it doesn't appear to have been retracted for very scientific reasons. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so I looked into it, and the journal claims that the calibration device that measures CO2 wasn't properly calibrated. Well, then redo the study. You know, the authors told me of that retracted article showing high CO2 levels in kids that wear masks, that they were never really given a good reason. And they asked for the additional review that was done of the article that resulted in its retraction. And the journal did not share it with the authors despite multiple requests. This is unheard of in medicine. And, you know, for all the money that we spend, for all the money sitting in the NIH that goes to research, $42 billion a year, we've given more money to the Wuhan Virology Institute than we have to studying this or masks in kids or anything else. Aging research got twice as much funding as COVID research last year.
Yeah, I mean, that's really stunning. Folks, listen, think about what the doctor said. $42 billion in funding, and no one's bothered to study the long-term effects of masking kids. I mean, that makes no sense. It's not even reasonable. Doc, a friend of mine, Dan Horowitz, over at The Blaze, wrote a piece about RSV, a virus that's pretty prevalent, sadly, in kids. And in the piece, he seems to suggest, looking at the data, that some of the kids in the hospital now with COVID, maybe not because of COVID, may be there because they had RSV, because they were locked up, they were on lockdown, their immune systems weren't getting stimulated, and a lot of this may be getting conflated, the numbers. In other words, Doc, because you're there in the hospital because of a respiratory virus, and you may have a co-infection of COVID, doesn't mean you're there because of COVID. And that distinction's important that we understand that, because we're making decisions assuming kids are being hospitalized because of COVID. Your thoughts?
If you break your arm, look, if you go to the hospital because you fell and got a cut on your arm, you're going to get tested for COVID with the most sensitive PCR test. And if you're under 18, that's going to count as a COVID admission, even though it may have had nothing to do with it. Now, I'm not downplaying COVID. It's increasing in children because it spreads rapidly. But right now, we need good data. Where are the numbers? The studies have not even been done to ask whether or not kids are getting COVID from other kids or from adults. that makes a big difference, because if they're getting it from adults, maybe schools are safer environments because we know kids are inefficient transmitters. These are the questions that the American people need answers to, and they're not getting them from our medical research establishment.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad we have to ask for data. I mean, you're a scientist, you're a medical professional. Doc, one quick last thing. There's a lot of information on the internet. Obviously, you have to sift through a lot of it. I caught dengue fever in Panama. It was nasty. Dengue fever, you can get antibody-dependent enhancement if you contract a different serotype later on. There is some information on the internet about vaccines, antibody-dependent enhancement. There's some confusion out there. Have you heard anything about that? I mean, I'm interested in the real science, and you're one of the few guys I go to for hard information.
Well, luck would have it, you have had one of the very rare few infections where if you get antibodies, those antibodies can hurt you with subsequent dengue fever infections. Now, there's 4 types of dengue fever. If you get infected with a different type, the antibodies to one could actually make this other type of dengue worse. The good news is there's really no evidence or suggestion so far that we're seeing that with COVID. We got to be vigilant. We got to be humble with all things COVID. But right now, we do see complications for any vaccine early with the vaccine. You see them in a few weeks if you're going to see them at all, and we've not seen that particular complication.